Part 18 of X, There Was a Man, the Saga of Gordon Kahl, a True Story. Page 165, Chapter 24, Quo Vadis. You can count the seeds in an apple, but you can't count the apples in a seed. I think this seed of a new era was germinated and precipitated during the fall of 1983. Grandpa has filed for an injunction with the aid of Ashley Michael Phillips to stop the sale of his property by the IRS on November the 4th. The IRS reported to the Marshal's Service. Deputy Marshal Carl Wigglesworth, who always seems to be lurking in the background of Grandpa's problems, informed Cheshire in Bismarck, who in turn advised Judge Bruce Van Sickle of Grandpa's fugitive status. The clerk did not file the documents, but turned them over to the judge instead. With all the meetings going on and farm foreclosures occurring, it seems evident that a connection existed. Within 4 months came the awful tragedy of Medina. Everyone at the roadblock suffered tragedy. Then 3.5 months of the travesties of jailings, federal rampaging, and the mockery semblance of a trial followed. The central question is, why all the federal action on a dormant matter? At the trial, Crook stated that Wigglesworth was emotionally scarred by events at Medina. The transcript just as accurately mistyped it scared. He reputedly underwent some psychiatric care, but possibly this was only a continuation of earlier treatment. He had cried while on the witness stand. Some observers think the tears were crocodile because of quick recoveries of composure. Shauna Fall and her 5 little children went back to the 1,000-acre farm. She has been plowing the fields and making the crops since the trial. Friends and neighbors restored the Kahl home where Yori and Janice had been living after the destroyers came. It was no small task. Grandma took both of us girls there to live. Sometimes Grandma would go to Shauna's a few weeks at a time during the busiest farming periods to help. Our store-bought food was purchased with money sent by anonymous givers, marked only "From God with Love." A Clinton, Arkansas newspaper, the Justice Times, was the instigator of this. Yori's dog recovered and hard-earned taxpayer money paid the $150 vet bill. Darrell Graff became bitter towards the news media, whom he believed portrayed him unfairly as a coward. He had acted very wisely, in fact. He soon lost his position in Medina and law enforcement contracts in 3 other places. Dr. Martin retired and moved to western Montana. It is very clear you don't have the right association without the Gestapo watching, he said. Bradley Capp continued as Stutzman County Deputy, less 1 index finger, continuing to hate his antagonist. He continues to live in Maudina, this pronunciation being adopted in 1949, following Judge Harold Medina's trial of 11 communists in New York. Medina's 520 residents don't like to talk about the shootout, with so many unanswered questions surrounding the incident. Shauna Fall, who is 29, has been married to Scott for 12 years. She and their 5 children, like Grandma, take one day at a time. Every day is hard. They try to visit Scott once a month in Wisconsin, 640 miles away. It's friends and family who have kept me together, she is quoted as saying. She has a sparkling personality and, like Scott and Yori, is deeply religious. She is resentful of news stories which suggest she is indifferent to the families of officers involved in the shootout. I believe they are hurting as much as we are, she said tearfully. I feel like we are all victims. 2 unsuccessful attempts were made to transfer DUSM Bud Warren, who was a year away from retirement. Some other marshals were ticked off because he testified favorably for the defense. He had no choice as an honest man, since he was subpoenaed. A local police officer heard the chief marshal talking with Gary Booth, Fargo IRS district director. We couldn't transfer him, but we're not through with Warren yet, are we? Booth said nothing, just smiled from ear to ear. Bud was soon audited. The IRS thought they had him at first for not reporting some interest income. But the oversight by Bud had been corrected the following year. The Marshal Service underhandedly broke its tradition of retiring marshals their invalidated badge and credentials when Harold Warren retired at the end of 1983. This was understandably insulting, and Bud felt offended. Several months of correspondence followed. In one letter he wrote, "My 30 years of law enforcement was never wavered from my initial law enforcement interest, being helpful to those who need help, admiring those who don't, despising those who look with scorn at the less fortunate, respecting those that reach out to the less fortunate, never to use my badge and position for any other reason than to serve the needs of the public." After receiving numerous untruthful letters from the USMS, he finally received a badge embedded in plastic in November 1984. So as far as I know, he was never awarded his plaque and other mementos ordinarily bestowed, though he continues to try to obtain them. Honesty and integrity seem more important to this lawman than popularity and authority. Louis Muir, 54, is learning to live alone and to adjust to feelings that threaten to overpower her as a grieving widow. She gets angry but doesn't blame anyone. There are so many circumstances that had to come together for the incident. Vernon Wegener, former streeter policeman, became a self-employed carpenter after being placed on probation for 2 years. Saying he wasn't into the Bible much at the trial, he has since become a regular church attender. Before the incident, I maybe went to church once or twice a year. Now I have only missed 2 Sundays. Joni Brower, 39, worked in food service until she had a disagreement with the state concerning sales tax collections. She did not consider herself to be a tax collector for the state. The search by the task force had rendered the Browers' paralegal business inoperative, especially with David in prison. Diabolically and defiantly, Joni and her 2 children live in a house in Harvey on welfare, living proof of what unwise tax and subsidy policies can do to work incentives. Joni claims that her husband is a political prisoner and expressed compassion for the families of the slain marshals. Joni told a reporter, if they, the officers, hadn't been so damn aggressive and more professional, this would have never happened. Dennis Fisher and Lynn Crooks turned to other matters. Essentially, the defendants are victims in this crime. Crooks said later, blaming Grandpa, "There are more victims than you can count." Yori's wife, Janice, and her 3 small children lived in Richmond, Minnesota for a while with Grandma. She eventually moved to Carrington, divorcing the imprisoned Yori 2 years later. Lynn Cheshire, widow of Robert, remained in Bismarck with her 2 small children and attends college. Wayne Reardon noted that 3 vehicles parked in his driveway were damaged by the gunfire, and as I mentioned, a federal bullet lodged 4 feet from his son's crib. He also believes the stress put on his father had caused his fatal heart attack during the trial. The court disagreed when the matter was litigated. The Fargo Forum reported that Lynn Martin, who once walked the state with a monkey on his back to protest taxes and later issued citizen's arrest for those who illegally searched his premises, became a lobbyist for the Liberty Lobby, Washington, D.C. It must be eerie having such a warrant outstanding against you. He wrote a short booklet about Grandpa, and I identified earlier, and a book, Medina, telling of the shootout. The other 2 Ashley residents who underwent searches, veterinarian James Coleman and Michael Phillips, moved their families to Canada. If they, North Dakota constitutionalists, think they have trouble up to now, they haven't seen anything yet, President Reagan had said to a slain marshal's wife by telephone. Yori went to prison firmly convinced that Freemasons were responsible for his misfortunes in some way to a large extent. Note these excerpts. Shortly before the trial, when several things were being said and done concerning the lodge, the rings began to disappear from the marshals and FBI agents. My attorney couldn't get a roster of Masons for the state, and the Grand Secretary denied that some persons were Masons, whom I knew were. We had a 32nd degree Mason who was working with Charlie O'Brien Sr. of the Constitutional Law Center, who knows Freemasonry well. I wanted to put him on the stand to testify about the subject. He called me. Judge Benson found out about it and had him jailed until after the trial. We also intended at one point to introduce a copy of Morals and Dogma by Albert Pike. My lawyer later decided to avoid the subject at the trial. I wanted Charlie for my counsel, but the judge would not permit it. By letters and conversations with Yori, he kept me informed of his plight. He wrote, after June 24th sentencing, Scott, Dave, and I soon flown to Leavenworth, Kansas. Security going to the airport was immense. 2 marshals accompanied us in the flight. The one in charge was a large, impressive Indian. We discussed the Wounded Knee incident and atrocities in general against Indians. Concerning our case, he said, "You see, we have a brotherhood, and whenever you go against one of us, you have to deal with all of us." We 3 glanced at each other knowingly, typical of today's public servants. His attitude towards other Indians' treatment was, "Rain on 'em. I got mine." Actually, what he said was more vulgar. At Leavenworth, my heirloom Bible and all my addresses and phone numbers were taken from me. After several days of being in separate cells, we talked with a lieutenant. He informed me that they had been monitoring the case since the beginning and said, "I don't know what to tell you. You need to get someone to write a book or something." He showed his concern and even allowed the 3 of us to be placed in a large cell together. However, higher-ups found out about it and separated us within 2 hours. Scott was placed in population there, and I have not seen him since. He was later moved to Oxford, Wisconsin. I was moved to 63 building, generally used for those who commit offenses in prison. I was placed in a cell with 2 homosexuals, and for some time I anticipated some serious problems. But I preached to them every day and can only hope I did some good. God's word does not return void. After a month, I was shipped to Lewisburg, Pennsylvania via Terre Haute and Milan, Michigan. I had the blessing of visiting David then, who was en route to Terre Haute. I was held over the whole in Terre Haute for 2 weeks, was in Milan for 1 night, and then to Lewisburg and again the whole for 4 days. They told me I was ultra high priority when finally placing me in the general population. Within 10 days, I was again put in the hole. After a week, a hearing was held strangely in a utility-like baggage room. The manager said, "I don't know why you were locked up. No one in the institution knows why you were locked up. All I know is we got orders to lock you up." The orders were from way up. He looked down at his desk and then back at me and said, "Way, way up." Yori must have recalled the psalmist scripture, "If I make my bed in hell, you'll be there." The ring on his finger told me all I needed to know. Coincidental with this lockup was publicity that Joan Kahl and others were to speak at a Gordon Kahl Memorial rally in Kansas and then Idaho. However, because of close surveillance and telephone threats to their safety, their appearance was canceled. They had learned also that the 3 prisoners had been placed in isolation in different prisons. After a good while, I was taken to El Reno, Oklahoma, and then to Bastrop, Texas, where the facility looked more like an apartment complex than prison. I befriended Ralph Baker, and we discussed government with several similar conclusions. One agreed observation was the extraordinary large portion of prison officials and other lawmaking and enforcement roles in government who were members of Masonic organizations. A double-headed phoenix, one of their greater symbols, is in Bastrop. Lodges and some federal buildings have cornerstone dates different from our Christian date. For reasons we'll never know, Ralph and I were rousted out of bed at 1 a.m. on a June night, 1984, and locked in the hole. Next day, they took us to the marshal's office in San Antonio, and that evening to maximum security in the county jail. I was returned to Lewisburg, and Ralph was sent to Terre Haute. He is a level 2 prisoner, and I am level 3. But we are much tighter security. We are in much tighter security prisons. Contrary to prison policy, also, I am too far from home. Here I am, though, and I try to teach others about Christ. Some knew nothing about him whatsoever. I once talked with a certain prison official in his office. One thing led to another, and he said, "I know you shouldn't be locked up. You're probably the only prisoner here that I can honestly say should not be here. But you have to look at the government side of the thing. I'm sure the government assassinated your father. I've worked for this government for many years, and it's no secret that they kill anyone who becomes a thorn in their side. There is nothing I can do. There is nothing any man can do. Within a few years, we will be a socialist country, and I am not going to stick my neck out. I was a pallbearer for Mr. Reinhardt, who was convicted on failure to file, charged along with my dad. A prisoner had called his wife and said 31 inmates were willing to testify that he was murdered in Safford Prison. He had a heart attack, which I'm satisfied was induced, and for several hours inmates did what they could for him, and passing guards refused any medical help. When at Springfield for evaluation, my father met a doctor from Cuba whose government was discussed at length. Previously, Dad had told me that he had met Padre Lance, a one-time friend to Castro, and learned that Castro was no more than a puppet for the very same internationalist who financed the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 from Wall Street. This doctor confirmed all this, including other things, one being Freemasonry's major role in accomplishing these goals. The doctor talked in a very quiet tone, and at the end of the conversation, Dad gave him a Masonic handshake. The doctor laughed and said, "All this time, I spoke quietly, and here you are, one of us." The doctor was mistaken. Although Dad was supposedly wanted for an alleged probation violation, he was placed under a $1 million bond before he was arrested. For a misdemeanor, be sure to note that they wanted to return him to Texas, not for anything he did, but because of what he had said. His talk concerned challenges to the 16th Amendment, the Federal Reserve Act, and similar farces, going further and telling of the high Masonic element that enabled such evils to occur. Yori wrote on, indicating how freedom of speech and many other constitutional rights have disappeared, replaced by tyrannical rulers. How many have been brought to justice for violating their oaths of office? He wonders, and writes that Cicero said it well. A nation can survive its fools and even their ambitions, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and carries his banners openly, but the traitor moves among those within the gate freely. His sly whispers rustling through the alleys, heard in the very halls of government itself. For the traitor appears not a traitor, for he speaks in accents familiar to his victims, and he wears their faces that lie deep in the hearts of all men. He rots the soul of a nation. He works secretly and unknown in the night to undermine the pillars of a city. He infects the body politic so that it can no longer resist. A murderer is less to be feared. Yori ends by writing, "The price of freedom and liberty has always been blood, sweat, and so very many tears," and closes with, "In service to the King of Kings for a return to American ideals." Yori is wise beyond his years, and yet has sincere remorse for the tragedies of the marshals. His life will no doubt be shortened from the effects of his own gunshot wounds. Babylon, O Babylon. Babylon, O Babylon, you rob the souls of men. You force them into poverty and rob them once again. You've never given anything but pain and misery. Your pleasure is their grievances. Your red eyes shine with glee. You rob the widows' houses, the orphans you destroy. You are the works of darkness, and terror you deploy. Oh, how you love your silver. Your golds become your pride. But when the Son of God returns, you'll find no place to hide. His angels will encircle you and stamp you into hell, just as your father Lucifer, from heaven's war he fell. Your days are surely numbered. Your empire shall pass. Your merchants and your servants will cry, alas, alas. The great and mighty city, with burning cinders smell, she's gone into her father, into the pits of hell. The days of grace have passed you by. The judgment now is set. The gnash of teeth and pestilence, for reward is what you'll get. The demons that begat you will dwell eternally with Jezebel and Lucifer in judgment's fiery sea. The whoremongers and Antichrist will share in your reward. That eternal lake of fire will be your room and board. You gave up eternal pleasure for the artifice of gold, and when you held it in your hand, you were powerful and bold. But now where is your power? Your golden God is dead. You've lost your silken glory and the crowns upon your head. Your rubies now have lost their gleam, your diamonds sparkle fail. When your memory returns to these, we'll hear your woeful wail. Then those of us who gave our lives and betrothed the King of Kings, who sacrificed through love and pain for splendored eternal things, will gaze upon you briefly as we enter through the gate. We'll be singing songs of joy, but for you, it's now too late. You said you were of Abraham, of Isaac, and Israel, but Jesus said if you were of us, that you'd be with us still. O synagogue of Satan, with your covert societies, you've spilled the blood of martyrs with your murderous sprees. You brought abominations and Balaam philosophy with you out from Babylon from your captivity. You spread it out through all the lands and thought you'd done so well, and those who bow the knee to you are twice the child of hell. Praise be to our Father and his sacrificial lamb, and those of you who hate him will be rewarded as the damned. O children of the prince of hell, your nature proved your deeds. Your fruit is of the thistles, your garden grow the weeds. Life lasts only moments, as a puff of smoke it's gone. We'll all be pleading mercy for all our human wrongs. But those of us who've cleansed ourselves through the blood of Christ Jesus will look back upon our lives as if sin never was. And will rejoice exceedingly when the scroll of names is read, and wondrously marvel at Mystery Babylon, the living dead. That was written by Yori von Kahl. We'll pick up the next part on page 176 with chapter 25. The name of that chapter is Refuge.